On a cold February night in 1962, President Kennedy called his press secretary into the Oval Office and gave him one instruction: bring me 1,000 Cuban cigars by morning. Salinger didn't sleep. He drove through Washington in the dark, hitting every shop he could find. By sunrise, he placed 1,200 cigars on the president's desk. Kennedy smiled, reached into his drawer, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and signed it. That paper was the executive order placing a full embargo on Cuba, making every Cuban product, including the cigars he'd just spent the night stockpiling, illegal on American soil. The man secured his personal supply first, then he shut the door on everyone else. Kennedy thought it would last a year, maybe 2. He was wrong. He died before the embargo ended. Then came Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, another Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and Trump again. 12 presidents. And the embargo is still standing. 65 years. And this tiny island, 90 miles off Florida, is still one of the most complicated geopolitical problems on Earth. To understand why, you have to go back before the revolution. In the 1950s, Cuba looked like a success story on paper. American investment was massive. Coca-Cola, General Motors, oil refineries, telephone networks, all deeply rooted in the island. But Havana was being run like a Caribbean Las Vegas. The dictator Batista had made an open alliance with the American mob. Casinos, luxury hotels, prostitution networks, all under government protection in exchange for a cut of the profits. The Cuban state was a business partner in organized crime. And while a small elite lived alongside foreigners in total comfort, millions of ordinary Cubans were drowning. Rural illiteracy was 4 times higher than in the cities. 17% of the workforce was completely unemployed. In the sugar industry alone, 457,000 workers sat at home with zero income the moment harvest season ended. That gap, that suffocating injustice. That's what built Fidel Castro. When he rode into Havana on a tank in 1959, hundreds of thousands of farmers and workers stood behind him, willing to die for change. And something did change, just not in the way anyone outside Cuba expected. Castro didn't stop at political power. He nationalized everything. Not some things, everything. Coca-Cola factories, gone. General Motors, gone. The mafia's casinos, gone. Exxon and Texaco refineries, gone. Anything with an American name became state property almost overnight. The U.S. eventually certified claims worth nearly $2 billion in original value. With interest, that number today sits at $9.3 billion. America has never forgotten it. Cuba has its own counter-invoice. In September 2027, the Cuban foreign minister submitted an official report claiming losses from the embargo now exceed $170 billion. 2 bills. Nobody pays. Nobody wants the account to close. Which brings you to the question that breaks the whole thing open. Why doesn't America just lift the embargo? It trades with China, which is communist. It normalized relations with Vietnam, where tens of thousands of American soldiers died. It does business with authoritarian governments worldwide without losing sleep. So why Cuba? Why 65 years? The answer isn't in Washington. It's on the cafe terraces of Miami. In the little Havana neighborhood in southern Florida, 2.4 million Americans of Cuban descent have built the largest Cuban community outside the island itself. These are people who left everything behind in 1959. Their children, their grandchildren. People who watched their homes and land get taken. They don't want diplomacy. They don't want negotiations. They want the regime gone. Full stop. Florida is a swing state, the kind that decides presidential elections. No serious candidate can afford to lose it, which means no president can announce they're lifting the embargo. The political price would be immediate and total. And in 1996, the Helms-Burton Act made it permanent. This law took the embargo out of the president's hands and gave it to Congress. One person can't undo it anymore. The law also allows American courts to sue any company anywhere in the world that does business in property confiscated after 1959. Spanish hotels, European airlines, French banks, all have faced lawsuits. In 2025, a court issued a ruling of nearly $30 million against a subsidiary of Expedia. The message to the world is simple. Touch Cuba, and we touch you. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because the Cuban government isn't exactly suffering from the embargo politically either. In Cuba, they don't call it an embargo. They call it el bloqueo, the strangling blockade. And that framing has kept the government alive for 6 decades. When the electricity fails, it's not mismanagement. It's America blocking spare parts. When medicine runs short, it's not a broken system, it's the blockade. When food runs out, it's not failed policy, it's the siege. One word. Every problem explained. No accountability required. An analysis published in October 2285 put it plainly. The Cuban government constructed a victim narrative as a smokescreen for its own corruption and incompetence. The blockade didn't just hurt Cuba, it became the regime's most powerful political tool. And this reveals the trap nobody talks about. If the embargo ended tomorrow and life still didn't improve, who gets blamed? The government. You've stripped away the one excuse that held everything together for 60 years. Lifting the embargo terrifies the Cuban leadership almost as much as it excites everyone else. Cuba has always survived by attaching itself to a patron. First, the Soviet Union, which at its peak covered roughly a quarter of Cuba's entire GDP. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, the economy shrank 35% in under 4 years, near famine. And instead of rebuilding independently, Cuba found a new patron, Venezuela, subsidized oil worth up to 20% of Cuban GDP at its height. Venezuela became Cuba's life support machine. Then in January 2026, Maduro fell, and the machine turned off. Cuba has received no oil shipments since. Mexico pulled its tankers after Trump threatened immediate sanctions on any country delivering fuel to the island. The island went dark, literally. Trump's January 2026 executive order turned the bilateral embargo into a global threat. Any ship, any country, any company attempting to deliver oil to Cuba faces immediate American sanctions. That's not America and Cuba fighting anymore. That's America telling the entire world to pick a side. But Washington's obsession with Cuba was never purely about ideology or votes. There's a harder calculation underneath it all. Look at the map. Cuba sits 150 kilometers from Florida. It sits directly across the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico, like a cork in the neck of a bottle. And that Gulf is the economic artery of the United States. Most of America's trade moves through the ports of Texas and Louisiana, deep inside that Gulf. Any hostile power with a foothold in Cuba doesn't just threaten American military security. It puts its hand on the switch of the American economy. This is not hypothetical. Russia operates its largest foreign intelligence base at Lourdes, outside Havana, capable of intercepting vast amounts of American military and civilian communications. In June 2024, a Russian nuclear submarine entered Havana harbor alongside a frigate and 2 support vessels. It was carrying hypersonic missiles capable of reaching Washington in minutes. No time for a warning siren, no time for anything. The New York Times reported in March 2026 that China maintains suspected intelligence stations on Cuban soil. Satellite imagery identified 4 suspected sites within 150 kilometers of American territory. Russian and Chinese eyes, open around the clock, pointed directly at the United States. This is the nightmare Kennedy never imagined when he signed that order in 1962. He secured his cigars, he signed his paper, he went to sleep thinking it would all be over soon. It wasn't. 12 presidents later, 10 million Cubans are trying to figure out how to cook dinner with no gas and no electricity, while Russian submarines sit in their harbor and the world's 2 biggest powers use their island as a chessboard. Kennedy thought he needed 1,000 cigars to outlast the problem. Turns out the problem outlasted everyone.